This is The Literary City with me, Ramji Chandran. Most of us who try to keep track of social and economic trends worldwide would have realized that almost all our inquiries and examples are based on what happens in the United States, at least in terms of our connection with the world outside our own country, whichever one it might be. Now, by whatever process and reason, what happens in the United States influences society around the world and shapes our thoughts culturally, economically, politically, socially. So it follows naturally that the leaders of thought in the US become the influencers of thought across the world. And one such thought leader is my guest today, Malcolm Gladwell, author of the mega successful The Tipping Point and several other books, Blink and Outliers, to name only two of them. If you haven't read The Tipping Point, here's a quick and dirty. The book looks at how new ideas, behaviors, or trends spread like an epidemic. When something reaches a certain level of momentum, which is Gladwell's tipping point, it starts to spread rapidly, almost like a virus. And when that happens, it doesn't just spread. It creates a ripple effect that has effects and consequences on society. He used one of those ideas when he spoke of the theory of broken windows. The broken windows theory holds that a single broken window of, say, a building left unfixed will encourage people to perpetrate violence on the rest of the building, break the other windows, maybe torch the whole place down. The theory of broken windows had been embraced at the time by the New York Police Department, and this led them to aggressively police the streets in an effort to combat crime early, or put another way, to fix a broken window, on the premise that small crimes left unpunished would lead to large crimes. After they did that, crime declined noticeably, and Gladwell attributed this decline in crime in New York City to their policy of adopting the broken windows theory. He authored a piece titled Tipping Point, which was published in the New Yorker magazine, and that was the origin of the famous book by that name, that sold well over a gazillion copies. But was there a correlation in reality? The efforts of the NYPD led to that infamous situation where at one point, in 1 year, 700,000 people were stopped and frisked for being suspicious. Of course, no one can reasonably tell what suspicious looks like, and so the police, acting on their bias, mainly stopped and frisked young men of color, black and Hispanic. Last month, in October 2024, Gladwell appeared in a TED Talks and apologized for having got it wrong. I asked him about this, and he explains it in our interview coming up in just a few seconds. He is on the Literary City today to talk about his latest book, predictably another bestseller, Revenge of the Tipping Point. In it, he revisits a number of ideas and theories, sometimes expanding on them and sometimes rejecting them. Revenge of the Tipping Point has Gladwell's familiar take on patterns and how the world works, but this time he looks at the dark underside of things. I am sure I will be able to ask only a small number of the questions in the time that I have, but truly I'm delighted to be able to ask him anything at all. To that end, social thinker, journalist, host of the podcast Revisionist History, and of course author, Malcolm Gladwell, welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
You know, for most people, the first question would be, what's different between Tipping Point and Revenge of the Tipping Point? Does the answer lie in the word revenge?
A little bit. I mean, the first book was written in such a hopeful moment. The end of the Cold War, the dramatic decline in social problems around the world, and then written by me at a time of my relative youth, in my 30s. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the world is there's a little less optimism, I feel like, in the world now. And I'm also much more conscious of the way in which people have been using epidemic principles for less than positive ends, shall we say.
Right. So I'd like to talk about what has now become an obvious question, broken windows. Now, in Tipping Point, like millions of others, I was fascinated by your application of the broken windows theory to what you perceived was the success of the NYPD's aggressive policing.
Mm-hmm.
Then last month in a TED Talk, you had a sort of confessional moment where you mentioned that you'd made a mistake about the effects of all that. So could you speak to us about the culpa in the mea culpa?
Yeah. Well, what had happened, the reason I wrote the first tipping point was that I had been witness, like many other New Yorkers, to this dramatic decline in the city's crime rate, violent crime rate in the 1990s, and wanted to explain how it could happen. How could a city in the span of 5 years see its crime rate, its murder rate? I mean, it was dropped by sort of 70% or more.
Right.
And no one could give me a good explanation. And the best explanation I could come up with was this theory that was very much in vogue in the 80s called broken windows theory, which said that small crimes were invitations to larger crimes. It was an epidemic model of crime. The criminals take their cues from their environment, and where they see they can get away with graffiti or jumping a turnstile on the subway or jaywalking across the street, they think, oh, there are no rules here, and they start to commit larger crimes. And the New York City Police Department interpreted that to say that what we need to be doing as a police department is being really aggressive in cracking down on smaller crimes. So they began to stop a policy called stop-and-frisk, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of mostly young people being stopped on the streets, and they were looking for guns and drugs, and they were also cracking down on these misdemeanors. And they thought that was the reason why larger crimes like robbery and murder were also declining. And I thought so too. And that's what I wrote in my first book. And then what happened was that a court ordered the New York City Police Department overnight to stop doing those kinds of extraordinary.
And this would be the Floyd case.
The Floyd case. And everyone, myself included, thought that that meant that crime was going to go back up.
Right.
And the opposite happened. They stopped doing the thing we thought that was causing crime to drop, and crime dropped still further. And that was a kind of learning moment that suggested that my explanation the first time around was incorrect.
And this debate, if you will, on this very subject is not entirely new, because you had a rather interesting exchange with the Freakonomics people some years before.
Yeah.
And, when it was being debated in your blog, you described that exchange between you and them. And you wrote this line over here: I prefer to think of Freakonomics not as contradicting my argument in Tipping Point, but as completing it. With revenge, is that what you're doing? Completing Tipping Point?
I suppose. I mean, it's you hate to speak with finality about a work of
right.
I would say now I would use the word extend because I don't want to foreclose the possibility that I will return to it or suggest that I now have it right. I think the mistake that all writers make and that I have made in the past is to assume when I have settled on a position that I have it right. And I think we now understand that the world is a pretty fast-moving place, and what you may feel as settled wisdom quickly becomes unsettled. The Freakonomics people, they were, they had this idea that it was the legalization of abortion in America in the early 70s that they argued it played the main role in reducing crime. Their argument was that a lot of children who were unwanted were being born, and being born an unwanted child was a kind of invitation or a preparatory ground for criminality, which I always thought they had to prove that, and they didn't. You need to prove. Right. So, imagine that, I have two children. If what they were suggesting that if my wife and I had a third child who was a surprise. That child would be more prone to criminality because we didn't plan for that child. I find that really, really hard to believe. Now, they were arguing, well, if a teenage mother has a child that she would otherwise not have wanted, that child is going to be... And I think there is some truth to that, but I still couldn't make the connection in my mind between that social observation about the circumstances of a child's birth and their predisposition 21 years later to criminality.
Did you revisit the rest of the book in a similar manner? I'm talking about tipping point in order to get to revenge.
Yeah, I for example, a big idea in the first book was this idea that I call the law of the few.
Mm-hmm.
This notion that an epidemic is propelled by a tiny fraction of the population. And we see this pattern over and over again.
Right.
And this time around, what impressed me was that number, that small number that are propelling an epidemic, is even smaller than I had realized. And maybe what has happened, maybe that's one distinctive mark of the era we live in now, as opposed to the era I was writing that first book in, that smaller and smaller numbers of people are sufficient to start and to drive an epidemic. I was thinking about this. There's so many examples of this. Online behavior, of course, is a classic example of this. Mm-hmm. Disinformation online is driven, we think, by less than 1% of users.
Right.
So it's in a profoundly asymmetrical phenomenon. That's exactly how epidemics work. And I had the chapter in the book on COVID pointing out that tiny fraction of people with COVID are responsible for spreading COVID. And again, that was not the intuition that drove our response to COVID in the first place. But I was thinking of this even in we had in the United States last spring an enormous number of campus protests over what is happening in Gaza, anti-Israel protests, and they were dominated the news. They were caused university presidents to resign. And I was having a conversation with someone yesterday at dinner who had been a student on those campuses, and they were saying, well, this at Columbia, one of the campuses that was sort of thought to be most convulsed by these protests. And they were saying, the number of students who were involved in these protests is probably less than 50. So we have a campus with 20,000 students, less than 50 mount protests. And yet the news treats it like the entire campus is in an uproar, as opposed to saying, no, it's, what would 50 be of 20,000? Tiny, tiny percentage.
But in terms of the statistics, it's I found that those two examples that you gave to be quite fascinating about this one young schoolgirl who infected a whole lot of people, the virus.
With me.
And on the other hand, there was this other student that came in from Wuhan with the virus and probably infected no one, right?
It's just, this is what we didn't understand in COVID was the extreme variability of transmission. That it was assumed that if you and I both have COVID, you and I both have equal chances of passing it on to someone else. And that is profoundly untrue. That for some reason we don't understand, a very small fraction of the population probably has a 100-fold greater, or even a 1,000-fold greater possibility. They're just producing so much more virus that their chances of passing it on are much more profound.
And do you suppose that going forward from here, there's been a lot of criticism about the way different countries, not just the United States, have handled their response to COVID. And most of the criticism has been that the response has been overblown and overcautious, and they didn't listen to the people that spoke against it and so on. And now that we understand through research like yours about the fact that it takes just a small number of people, could that materially affect how the next pandemic is handled? Or is it batten down the hatches and be as careful as you can, business as always?
I think it will. I think in a way that actually might be quite socially complicated. It very much will direct the way we handle the next virus. I mean, the next pandemic, with this knowledge in mind, it's not just, it's two things. It is a small number of situations create a risk of transmission of the virus, and a small number of people. And I think both of those factors. So, for example, there was in America. I don't know what it was like in India, but in America, in the last pandemic, there was this ban on outdoor activities.
Same thing.
People were not told, they couldn't go to the beach. Or I remember trying to go running at a local running track, and the track was closed. We now realize that's nonsense. That the risk of transmission outdoors is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the risk indoors. And then what you really should be doing in a pandemic is driving people outdoors. So the best place to be is on a beach. The wind is blowing. The air is humid. The virus is just going to fly away. I mean, it's not like, it's an airborne virus. It dissipates in the outdoor air.
Right.
And still indoor air, it stays there, and it gets drawn into your lungs. So that will change. But also, I think we will make an attempt, I suspect, to identify who these super spreaders are, and to say, these are the ones who need to constrain their behavior. The rest of us don't. And so we'll develop these kind of highly variable strategies.
Has the CDC embraced this principle, up to your knowledge?
I have no idea. I'm sure privately they're aware. This was an understanding that became clear only at the very end of the pandemic. And we didn't learn. It wasn't until a British group did the first, what do they call them? Where they deliberately infect people. A challenge trial. Until the thing that hobbled us with the pandemic was that we didn't understand how the pandemic infected people, because we could only ever study it once someone had been infected. We had no way of, there was no way to kind of understand what was happening at the moment of infection. So finally, a British group got together, a large group of healthy volunteers, under controlled circumstances in a hospital, deliberately infected them, and then studied exactly what happened. And that was when we learned with absolute certainty that in that group, I think there were something like 25 people, and 23 of them, all of whom got infected, and 23 basically didn't pass on the virus to anyone, and 2 did. And that was when so I suspect around the world, infectious disease specialists, I hope, took note of that finding and are incorporating that into their plans for next time.
Well, I certainly hope so, because some of the responses to COVID were absurd. And before I move on from this subject, do you think that the core idea of fixing broken windows is still valid in some contexts, or does it have to be challenged?
I do think it's valid. I think we have to make a distinction between civility and criminality. And so I think that what has happened in America, for example, in cities like San Francisco, is that they have the problem with incivility has grown so dramatic. So many homeless people, so many misdemeanors, so much kind of everyday disorder that people have left the city in droves, and the city's downtown has essentially disappeared, although maybe coming back finally. That's not necessarily a cause of violent crime, but it is the cause of the death of a city. And so, I'm not saying you shouldn't pay attention to these signs of disorder. That absolutely is an important thing in the health of a city. It's just that that's not preventing murders. That's
right.
Take home.
Right. I guess so. The next part of the book that I spent quite a bit of time reading and going down rabbit holes is the concept of the magic third.
Yeah.
And That chapter has a distinct idea and it has a distinct example as well. And you give some ideas of social engineering, which you mention is one of the, what are the words that you use? Central activities of the U.S. government.
Yeah, or the U.S. establishment.
U.S. establishment. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. U.S. establishment. How do they try to achieve this, and to what end? I mean, I don't see it as a kind of cabal where a bunch of old guys meet in a room rubbing their hands together. How does it actually work in practice?
Yeah, so the idea here is that the question is, how many outsiders need to join a group before the composition of the group changes?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if we have a group made up entirely of, Canadians, how many, native-born, white Canadians, how many immigrants from India do we have to introduce before, the Canadians are comfortable eating curry and, I use this example because this was my hometown. I grew up in a town called Waterloo in Ontario, which was a university town, which was one of the first communities in North America to accept a very large number of Indian students. My father, who was a math professor, his grad students for the first 30 years that he taught at Waterloo were almost 100% Indians.
Wow.
And hundreds of these Indians came to this, what had been a very sleepy, white, rural town in southern Ontario. And at a certain point, the number of East Asians grew to the point where the town was transformed. And I mean in the best possible way. It went from being a deeply parochial Canadian town to being a profoundly cosmopolitan and intellectually dynamic. It's now the center of the third biggest tech center in North America. The Waterloo region is now. So what happened was, in the beginning, one graduate student shows up from Mumbai in 1969, and it's still a profoundly rural Canadian parochial place. 2 show up, it's still parochial. 3 show up, it's still parochial. But at a certain point, it tips. What's that point? Turns out there's a great deal of social science directed at this question. And the feeling is that when the outsiders, the newcomers, reach about 25 to 33%, between a quarter and a third, they have the ability to profoundly change the composition of the group, right? And that's the tipping point. So when our East Asian students hit around just north of a quarter of my little town, the town changed. And I saw that growing up. This is absolutely what happened. So the argument in the book, I'll talk about this in a variety of different contexts, but I think that there are I use the example of Harvard University, has worked very, very hard to make sure that no outside group ever reaches that magic point. So they have kept every non-kind of establishment American white group below a third. It's because they would like to maintain their traditional culture. They feel that's part of what Harvard stands for, is a kind of American waspy,
right,
privileged white. And if they do not want to turn into, by contrast, if you go to another, fabled American establishment like MIT or Caltech, they are now majority East and South Asian, right? So that's the game they're playing.
And when you talk about, let's talk about the famous example of housing. When too many people of a certain ethnicity move into a neighborhood, it's been seen that there's been an exodus of white people. So the question is, this reaching that tipping point, that magic third, what's the distance between there goes the neighborhood and that's it, we're moving?
it's very, very hard to say with certainty, but it seems like this is a change that happens very suddenly. That we're talking about something inherent in human perception that makes a very sharp distinction between a manageable number of outsiders and what feels like an overwhelming number of outsiders. It is not a linear progression. It's not that I get it's not that I get a little more uncomfortable as the number grows. It's that I'm fine with it until a certain point when I suddenly change my mind and think, this is not the world is not the way it used to be.
But that brings me to somebody who tried to do something radically different from this, and that's the what you wrote about, the Palo Alto Fair Play community, who actually tried to engineer a strict ratio of balancing out who lives where and who can be whose neighbor and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It is heartwarming from one sense, but astonishing that anyone would even try something like that. And that too, this is back in the 40s and the 50s, which makes it even more interesting. So it seems that they were trying a different form of social engineering.
Yes.
Doesn't it?
So they were trying to, so this is a fascinating case study. At the time in the 1950s, you had this phenomenon across the United States of whites leaving cities because they perceived the number of incoming Black people to have reached a tipping point. They thought that, and so it's called white flight. And I mean, hundreds of American cities emptied out in a span of a very short period, 5-6 years. And there was this community in Palo Alto which was determined to buck that trend. And they thought, if there is this tipping point where, if outsiders reach this magic third number or exceed it, and the dominant group becomes terrified and leaves, the way to fight this is to make sure that no outside group ever exceeds this magic third. And so they created a community that was made up of East Asians, whites, and African Americans. And the rule was no one of these three groups could ever exceed 1/3. And by doing this and by making it plain that if you were a white person, you could only sell your house to a white person. If you were black, you only sell your house to a black person. And making it plain that the proportions of the group would never change, then they were able to remain stable at a time when every other urban neighborhood was profoundly unstable. So they use these same principles, only this time for a positive social end. They weren't trying to they were trying to fight what had been a devastating pattern of urban upheaval across the United States.
How did it end? Did it end well?
It did. The community managed to, in this period where almost every other American city is in dramatic upheaval, this area called the Lawrence Tract in Palo Alto stayed stable. And only when the kind of threat subsided in the late 1960s did the community relax its regulations.
Astonishing, audacious even.
Yeah, it could never happen today. I mean, no one plays those games today.
No. You did have an interesting sentence about that when you said that when most people play games around the tipping point, they do so on the sly, and I thought that's a very telling line. In the chapter, you also make this interesting mention. Certainly, it's going to be of great interest to 50% of my listeners. Is the mention of the Indian, rather the South Asian community, if you like. And you pointed out that between the time that Indira Nooyi took over Pepsi and Lakshman Narasimhan took charge of Starbucks, the press didn't find it necessary to say that Narasimhan was born in India. And you have said that that's a tipping point that had been reached.
Yeah.
I'm very interested to know what were the mechanics that led you to believe that this was the case. If I may, just as a quick aside, the way few people have been looking at it is to watch the sitcoms in America. And when you see a greater Indian presence in these things, you realize that it's pretty reflective of how America sees its own communities, and it's on display in TV shows.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I don't have a definitive, I'm open to all, arguments on this one. So what I was curious about was I happened to read the memoirs of this woman ingenuity who was the first, became the chief executive officer of Pepsi, at a time when there had never been another Indian woman who was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and vanishingly few Indian CEOs of any kind. And when she is appointed CEO, there is an extraordinary amount of attention paid to the fact of her Indianness. So every single article written about her, in some way, either mentions prominently where she comes from, or engages in some kind of crude stereotyping about, she's wearing a sari and has a bindi, all this kind of thing. None of which was true, by the way. People cannot get past the fact of she's such a novelty, and her background is such a novelty that they cannot get past that fact and sort of just treat her as another. And then fast forward, I don't know how many years, 20 years or so, and an Indian is appointed CEO of Starbucks, and there's no attention paid whatsoever to the fact of his upbringing. He's just treated like another. So something clearly happens in the interim. And, in that intervening period, there had been a very, very large, particularly the tech sector, a very, very large number of Indian CEOs had been appointed. And my argument was this is probably a process analogous to the one I'm talking about, where the outsiders the newcomers reached a certain point and they changed the composition of the group. So it became normal or no longer noteworthy that someone of that background was taking this position. I think there must have been multiple avenues for this. My thing, I didn't go into the book, but on the question of Indians, a very, very large number of, you probably know this, realize this, of Indian physicians came to America in the 1970s. Right. And because of the need for physicians was greatest in rural areas, many of them moved to the South, so there were a lot of white, sort of lower income white Americans who had an initial exposure to an Indian professional dating back 50 years. Right. And so in a way they would never have had a black physician. They would never have had a Chinese physician, but they had an Indian physician. So someone in a position of trust in their community and respect in their community going back decades. So I think there was something about that, and now you see, if you look at the Trump administration nominees, I've forgotten how many Indians this is, but there's a lot. It's like 3 or 4, I think. So you have a kind of, Indians have been welcomed into the mainstream far more quickly than other cultural groups. And understanding that you mentioned sitcoms, same thing. There aren't a lot of in the same way, not a lot of East Asians in American sitcoms. Right. So there's some peculiar and fascinating phenomenon that's going on here, but it has to do with Indians just reaching that tipping point faster than any other comparison group.
I thought that it had to do something with two things. Number one is the Indian obsession with education, especially STEM stuff. And the other is early American immigration policy, where if you had a degree and you were going to contribute some way scientifically, you're in. So
it's more marked. It's, as you know, it's more marked in Canada.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, cities like Vancouver and Waterloo and Toronto have a, and I think that the first, well, I guess it would be England, but the next Western country to have a prime minister of Indian background is almost certain to be Canada. Right. If I was placing a wager, I would wager on Canada as the next one.
Well, oddly, Ireland had somebody who who came pretty close.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
Right. So we show up in the strangest of places, I guess.
That's right.
So, and I wanted to ask you, going back to the sort of, you conflate some of the ideas that we've talked about right now, which includes social engineering and so on, and the cause and effects of actions that were taken. It brings me to a question of my receiving manipulation and then blaming that versus my own responsibility. I know this is not a new thing to talk about, but still it's relevant in the circumstances. The dynamics you speak of have that air of manipulation and control. So how are you looking at it in terms of weighing that against one's personal responsibility? Cliched though that is.
Yeah. But it is possible that the most, I hate to use the word radical, but extreme of my positions is that I am generally unimpressed by the contribution of individual responsibility to actions. I don't know what to do about that fact, because I realize we have to formally hold to the doctrine of personal responsibility. But a huge amount of my work over the years is devoted to the ways in which human behavior is unconsciously shaped by environment.
Right.
And so you can't keep writing about how we're creatures of, this book has a whole section on overstories, and, the kind of, an incredibly vague, common set of narratives that exist in the communities that we belong to that shape our behavior. You can't keep writing about these external influences on human behavior and still cling to a naive view of human responsibility.
Right. I was rather hoping you'd say that. And this question of virality, we talked about the tipping point, and that presumes a certain virality. In a very broad sense, have things changed with social media being more algorithm-driven virality than organic?
I don't know, because I don't know. I find that I largely leave social media out of this book for a number of reasons. But one of which is that I don't really understand it. And
right.
I think people who claim to understand it are probably one. The second thing is virality. We're obsessed with this notion of virality now and how quickly things spread. But the simple truth is that things spread far more effectively, things spread far more widely in the years prior to social media than in the years after. A viral phenomenon online can be have incredibly small reach. These things, I once saw the statistics on what it meant for a post on social media to go viral. And the numbers are laughably small.
I agree.
Whereas in the, I talk in the book about these television shows in the 70s that were watched by half of all of the viewing public in the United States. There's nothing today, nothing that reaches half of the American public. So I don't know. It strikes me virality was a much stronger, if we define virality as the idea that something would spread widely throughout a population very quickly, that is much more profoundly true of the pre-internet media landscape than it is of the post-media internet landscape.
That's true, isn't it? So many rumors have resulted in catastrophe, and they've spread with nothing more than maybe a telephone if they were lucky back in the day.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, it's true. It's so true. Personally, you became a dad recently and twice?
I did. Yes, I have.
That's wonderful. Congratulations on that. And
thank you.
The obvious cliched question, how has it changed you?
It has. Well, I have given up trying to give advice on parenting. That's for sure. I now realize that it's a fool's game, and children just do what they want, and so. No, it's made my life more, certainly more joyful, and it has. It forces you to be a lot more productive. You have to make the demands on your time are now such that you have to make the most of those few moments you have. So But no, I'm just enjoying myself more. I think there's a very simple answer to the question.
So I've been told. I'm not a parent, but before I let you go, what are you? Contrarian, confrontationalist? Are they the same thing?
I'm not a confrontationalist because I'm not very interested in picking fights with people. I mean,
right.
But I think I am. I think it's very useful and important for journalists, writers, to have a contrarian streak. In other words, because if a doctor is a contrarian, it has consequences.
Right.
Someone's life is at stake. There are many professions that are status quo oriented by of necessity, right? If an engineer has a contrarian streak in the way he or she designs a bridge, it's a problem, right? But writers, the stakes for us are lower. And I say this, too many writers, I think, pretend that they are engaged in a process that is as urgent and as other professions. I think that's profoundly wrong. It has it backwards. Our stakes are lower. That allows us to be adventurous.
Right.
It is, and it allows others to kind of safely explore alternatives and make the decisions that are of consequence. We're not the ones making consequential decisions. We're simply, our role, I think, is to seed productive conversations that allow people to explore possibilities that might not otherwise have occurred to them. And we can do that precisely because nothing is at stake.
Right.
And I am a contrarian in that sense. I am someone whose job it is to play with ideas, and it doesn't matter if I'm wrong, right? That's why I have license to play. I mean, I would say it matters only in a small way if I'm wrong. That's why I have license to play.
Right. That's fascinating. So you will continue to poke the bear. And who's next in your crosshairs, or what's next in your crosshairs?
I'm writing a book about anger.
Wow. Okay.
And the uses of anger. What are the strategies available to the angry? And it's sort of half done, and I'm still thinking about it. I'd like to write a little more. The goal is to write a book that is a little more intellectually rigorous than I normally write. In other words, not worry so much about reaching a broad audience, but I'd like to write something that is a little more serious and kind of. Anyway, that's the hope.
Well, when you do, more power to your elbow, and maybe I hope to be able to get you back on the show after that book comes out.
I would love that.
That's wonderful, Malcolm Gladwell. Thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Malcolm Gladwell, author of the book Revenge of the Tipping Point. There's a link in the podcast description to where you can buy that book, but please support your local bookstore. And that is our show. I'd like to thank my guest, Malcolm Gladwell, for a very wonderful conversation. Coming up on The Literary City are some absolutely fascinating authors, and I cannot wait to bring them to you. As always, I will do my best to make sure that we have a lot of fun together. Until next time, thank you for listening. I am Ramji Chandran, and this is The Literary City.